Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Steve here, helping you go a little deeper. So, for this Sunday's scripture readings, there's a bunch of great ones, and one of them is one of my favorite readings of all, which comes out of the book of Acts in chapter 2. It's after Peter gives his great speech at Pentecost and 3,000 people convert, which we're going to look at as we go on through the Christian year and we get to May 31st and Pentecost. But this comes at the end of chapter 2, where we then get the results of what happened with that and how people dealt with it. And it says, everybody devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. Those four things together, apostolic teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers, have been the four key ingredients to worship ever since. If you look at anything throughout church history, you'll see when worship services were created, that's what they had, apostolic teaching. In those first days of the church in Pentecost, and as Paul's writing his letters and whatnot, the apostolic teaching was literally the apostles teaching about Jesus Christ. The Gospels hadn't been written yet, Paul's letters hadn't been written yet, so they took the Old Testament and they read it in the light of Jesus, which is what Peter's sermon is all about, what Paul's sermon later on, his first sermon in Acts chapter 13 is all about, and it gives the understanding of who Jesus is as the Messiah. And then also retells the story of Jesus, which is what we now have in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the apostolic teaching. We still have that when we read Scripture in our churches and for our worship. The fellowship, that's not just fellowship hall kind of fellowship. That's not just coffee hour kind of fellowship, which is something that a lot of people have really been craving over these last several weeks. You know, whether they were doing drive-in church and just had to honk and wave at people and missed that personal interaction, or whether people have been watching things on computer screens or on TV screens at home. It's really been kind of crazy for a lot of people. Of course, for a lot of introverts, it's actually been wonderful. They get everything that they wanted from church, and they don't have all of that awkwardness of actually having to deal with other people right up close. And so when everything goes back to normal, we're going to have to give the introverts a little bit of grace, and hopefully they'll give the extroverts a little bit of grace too. But that fellowship is more than just, hey, how's it going? Have a cup of coffee. Or have a donut or a bagel if you live up in New York, because for whatever reason they don't do donuts at church, they do bagels. It's that participation in people's lives. It's truly getting to know one another, opening ourselves up to one another, and living life together, which is why it follows it right up in Acts with, and there was no one in need among them. They sold everything that they owned and gave it to the apostles so that it could be distributed. They were literally doing life together. And they were doing it voluntarily because they were engaging in that kind of fellowship. The Spirit had prompted them so much that they were able to actually share not only what they had, but who they were with each other. So that's what that fellowship was. The breaking of bread, that's one of those phrases that a lot of times either means they ate together, or it means they had communion together, Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. In this context, and a lot of people like to translate it or like to interpret it as being meals, that's really not what it's talking about here. It's really talking about the Lord's Supper. We know that because that same phrase is used in lots of other places throughout Acts, and it definitely means it there. So Luke, who wrote Acts, which is why if you read in the very beginning of Acts, it says, in my first book, O Theophilus. This is the second book. Luke is using that term to mean the Lord's Supper, the sacrament, the breaking of bread, the sharing of the cup. And that was always a part of worship in Christian history. It's for some churches more frequently than others, in some regions more frequently than others, but it's been there. And then the prayers. And it's interesting, a lot of our English translations say prayer there in Acts 2:42. The actual Greek there, it says the prayers. They taught them specifically how to pray and which prayers to pray. Now, we don't know exactly which ones those were, but one that we definitely know was the Lord's Prayer, because that prayer really serves as a model for all of our prayers. It acknowledges who God is. It asks for God to be at work, and then it makes petition for ourselves and for our loved ones around us. So those four things together all have always been a part of Christian worship ever since that very first Pentecost Sunday, way back in the year 30 AD. So this is Dr. Steve. I hope that helped you go a little deeper. If that's all you have time for, great. If you have time to go even deeper yet, a little bit deeper yet, please continue on. Because it's really interesting when you look at these four things and how that all works out, especially in the situation where we find ourselves now. The one thing we absolutely cannot do is communion. Now, there's been a lot of debate online, and if you're a theology theology wonk, a theology nerd like me, you really kind of get into this stuff and you follow it all. There's been a lot of stuff online about, should we celebrate virtual communion? Should we celebrate communion in our homes? Have the worship service on the screen, everybody watching it, and have their own little cup and their own little piece of bread, or their own big cup and their own piece of bread. And then once the prayers are prayed, then everybody in the comfort of their own homes takes communion together. And as far as the United Methodist Church is concerned, the answer really fairly consistently has been, no, we don't think this is a good thing. As far as other traditions have been concerned, the Free Methodist Church has said, well, we think you can do it, but with some guidelines and a few restrictions. There have been other churches, non-denominational churches, that say, hey, grab whatever you've got and let's do communion. And there have been other communions, like the Roman Catholic Church, who they would look at that and go, how in the world could you even think of doing something like that? And for me, the issue is one of, what is communion supposed to be? What is really happening when we celebrate the Lord's Supper together? That's the main issue. It's not just, this is something the church is supposed to do, so we need to do it. Oh, it's the first Sunday of the month, we need to do it. Oh, we've got Easter coming up, we should do it. The big one was, it's Maundy Thursday, it's Holy Thursday. How do we celebrate that when we don't do the Lord's Supper? Well, from the Methodist tradition, this is nothing new to us. We started out not having access to the Lord's Supper in this country for the most part. John Wesley, when he founded this movement, it was a renewal movement within the Church of England over across the pond in England and Ireland and Scotland. And he gathered people together and they met every week, usually on Thursday nights, and they worshiped. And they shared testimony, they shared life together, they read scripture, they prayed, they saw people's lives transformed. But the one thing that they never did was communion. Because communion was in the church. It was in the Church of England, it was in the Church of Scotland, it was in the Church of Ireland. And so the people went to those churches on Sunday mornings to receive communion. And quite often, they actually were refused to have communion. Here in this country, it was even worse. There were so few clergy in this country before the American Revolution, because this is the 1700s now, that people didn't have access to communion on a regular basis. And then when the American Revolution began, because Methodism started out as a renewal movement within the Church of England, John Wesley was an ordained priest in the Church of England. England was the enemy. People didn't want to go there. They didn't want to fraternize with the enemy. They wanted their own thing. And so for 20 years, the Methodist movement here in the colonies and then the beginnings of the United States of America really didn't have access to communion. And yet God blessed it, and God continued to grow it. Lives were transformed. People were saved. People were sanctified. It was an amazing thing. Revival spread across the land. And there was this missionary zeal to go and evangelize neighbors and friends and people who lived in the next farm over and the next county over. And as the whole nation picked up and began moving west after the Revolution, as settlers went out and they were carving out new territories, chances are they found a Methodist out there who started new worship. And that's how we continued to move. But the access to the Lord's Supper was still lacking because there was never enough clergy around for it to be readily available. This is why a lot of churches today still only do communion quarterly. I mean, when churches that have it once a month, that's a great thing. I personally like it lots of times because I love engaging in that kind of fellowship with God. But it's not the thing itself that is so important. God himself proved that. When it is not available, he will work in other ways, mightily. He will share his grace. He will share his power, his love, his transformation in ways that we don't even expect. And sometimes that result will be even greater than if we'd had access to the original thing itself. That's what those original Methodists discovered. When they would gather together in their meetings and they would share testimonies, they had something else that they would do. It was called a love feast, and it would be bread and water. It wouldn't be bread and wine. And grape juice wasn't invented yet. Thomas Welch, good Methodist that he was, hadn't figured out a way to have non-fermented grape juice yet. So they wouldn't have bread and wine. They would have bread and water. And it would be a part of a testimony service. And it was meant to help us understand fellowship and not as a replacement for the Lord's Supper. And God still showed up mightily. And so while we're in this season of waiting for everything to come back to normal, waiting to gather together, waiting to figure out exactly what does church look like while we're online, and what is it going to look like once we all get back together, and yet we've had this huge foray into online digital worship. How is all of that going to work? Take this time to ask God why we do what we do. And don't be afraid to ask him that. God's big. He can handle big questions. Why is it that we do what we do? What is the purpose of it? It's not just simply because that's what we do. That was the Pharisees' answer for things. Why do we do this? Well, because we've always done it, because that's what we do. That's not the right answer. Ask God, why do we do what we do? And how is it that we can experience the same results if we're not able to do that? God will respond to each one of us in ways that we can actually understand. And he will help guide us and direct us even in this instance. So if you find yourself longing for that kind of fellowship, longing for communion, longing for life together, that is a wonderful thing. Hold on to that longing. I mean, it's been several months for a lot of people. It's been just a little over a month for others. Now, here's the thing. We have waited and waited and waited for centuries for Christ to return. We can wait a few more weeks to gather together, to celebrate communion, to fully worship together once again with the apostolic teaching, with the fellowship, with the breaking of bread, with the prayers. Hold on just a little longer. In the time that you've got right now, where we can't experience that fullness, ask God to help you experience him even in ways that you didn't expect. This is Dr. Steve. I hope this helped you go a little deeper. If you like it, please click like. If you want to subscribe, please do that too. Until next time, God bless.